There's Nathan, we're way down on the second page. Pleasure to introduce Nathan Manion. As I indicated, we've worked with, Doctor and I have worked with Nathan for a long time, and even with my current employer, we're in discussions with Nathan about doing an LCA. So Nathan's the Director of Greenscale, and he's going to talk about LCA and provide bits of the history and the current practice. He's got a PhD from Queen's in the Renewable Energy Development and Implementation Lab, courtesy of Warren Navi, who many Switch people will probably know as well. I'm going to stop there because I know we're running a little behind time, and we're going to turn it over to you, Nathan. And so, it's 20-ish minutes of presentation, and then we'll open it up to discussion. And if we don't get to sector news, so be it. The price we pay for being a little late. Thank you, Nathan.
Okay, thank you for that kind introduction, David. I'm just going to pull the presentation up, hopefully. Okay, can everyone see that?
Yep.
Okay.
I can anyway.
All right.
Yes, looks good.
Okay, so thank you everyone for joining me this morning. It's great to see so many people out this early on a Friday morning. And broadly, what I want to talk to you today is based on the sort of the pictures in my title slide here, is that LCA really tries to capture the environmental impacts of products or services across all the stages of a supply chain, all the way from resources to end of life. And I see LCA as an approach that is critical to understanding sustainable solutions, and which I'm happy to see is more on people's radar than it was several years ago when I first started in this area. And even though full life cycle assessments only make up a fraction of the work that we do at Greenscale, integrating life cycle thinking into our projects is always something we try to integrate into our work, which I'll try and discuss a bit later. But what I wanted to sort of first focus on in this talk is where LCA as a method originated from, how it evolved to the standards and methods that exist today, because I think how the methods are designed reflect a bit about where it came from, but also I think help guide how it can continue to evolve. So where I want to start is way back at the beginning of LCA. So back in the late 60s and early 70s, it was at this time that the precursor to LCA was developed, and it was known as a REPA, or a Resource and Environmental Profile Analysis. And the very first commercial REPA was performed by the Midwest Research Institute and funded largely by Coca-Cola. And the question Coca-Cola had was, which beverage container was the best container to produce? And the analysis included material and energy flows that were used in the production, use, and disposal of the beverage packaging itself, which quite honestly sounds a lot like an LCA. And the 8 different packages evaluated, which are sort of listed in that blue box at the bottom. And one of them, interestingly, is a returnable and refillable dive. But there were 2 main takeaways that the beverage companies summarized. And the first was that all the containers had some type of environmental impact, and that in of itself was significant. But what they also summarized was that less energy was used by recycling aluminum cans and plastic over the use of glass. And these takeaway points had real socioeconomic impacts across a whole number of sectors. In particular, what they did is they helped design and create our modern recycling industry and infrastructure. So the beverage companies, they work directly and hand in hand with local governments. They helped develop these robust recycling programs that we see today, and really was about recapturing the value in aluminum and then later plastic. But there are a few really good articles out there, one by John Sear, that have dived a bit deeper into this story. And rightfully, their main critique is that the actual results of the study are unknown, so that the full results were never published. However, a few years later, MRI was contracted to do the same analysis, but this time it was for the beer brewing industry. And the other difference was that the results and the methods were made public. And so in their results, they found that it was highly unlikely that any of the other containers compared would be able to match or surpass the impacts of a returnable bottle. And that on average, if it was returned back 10 times, it would be twice as good as the next best option. So in other words, maintaining some sort of system to support bottle return and refilling was a much more environmental responsible choice. And so that study and a whole bunch afterwards is really what informed our beer bottle return programs. So in Ontario, for example, and this is data from 2017, I don't think a lot of people know this, but that refillable containers made up 85% of the beer containers sold in Ontario. Their average lifespan of 15 refills was significantly longer than the minimum 10 refills we saw in the 1974 study. And so the beer bottle deposit program is actually one of the is actually recognized as one of the most successful environmentally conscious programs in North America. Now, there were some key differences though between these two studies. So the first was that while both studies looked at environmental categories such as materials, energy, water, waste, and emissions, the corporation-sponsored study included an 8th category, and this was economic impacts. And specifically, the lighter weight of plastic and aluminum lowered shipping costs. They increased the convenience and use of shipping. They reduced the use of fuel. So if you looked just at those stages, they were a lot lower based on just parts of the life cycle, but not the whole life cycle. And also conveniently, they were stages that could lower the economic costs for the company, not necessarily the entire supply chain. And so the reason I wanted to highlight this case first is because this sort of cross linkage between economic and environmental indicators in LCA methods, it doesn't exist today. And it's sort of this type of economic strong arming, if you will, for why the current LCA methods are completely separate from economic metrics. And the economic metrics that people often associate with life cycle cost analysis is a completely different economic analysis and separate method. Now, that's not to say that LCAs can't be used in coordination with a life cycle cost assessment. And I've certainly incorporated both in the same report myself, but it's important to know that they are separate methods and they have separate results. Because what happened in the 70s and 80s was this explosion of these REPA type LCA studies. They lacked international scientific discussion. There were no common methods on how they could be performed. And there's really these impossible challenges when you're trying to balance economics and the environment, particularly through the lens of, say, the perspective of for-profit products and services. So in other words, the variation in the way that early LCAs were being performed led to all sorts of methodological problems. And they were so bad that LCA was banned from advertisements in the early 90s in the US until there could be proper methods developed. So in the 90s, following this sort of large greenwashing crisis, there began this considerable international cooperation. So both the European and North American branches of CTAC got involved. Then in 1994, the ISO International Standards Organization became involved. And then in 1997, as the Life Cycle Initiative was created, and I highly recommend looking at the Life Cycle Initiative website. They have some amazing resources there that can sort of guide you for standards and other sorts of links that are really useful. And then finally, in 2006, we had the latest amendment of the ISO standards, which added ISO 14044, which added environmental standards. Now, there are a whole series of ISO 14,000 standards, and what I want to do is just kind of talk about them, I think, to help people understand how they are related to each other. So the first part is that all of these standards are voluntary. The next is that they're generally organized into two different types of standards. There's the standards that cover management of organizations, and then there are the standards that cover the life cycle of products. But from a scope perspective, you can see here in the graph here with the green circle, that for the ISO 14040 and 14044 standards, these are evaluating a number of different environmental impacts. So carbon, water, eutrophication, acidification. But there are some studies that may want to look at one particular environmental impact in more detail. So in particular, those that focus exclusively on carbon would fall under the carbon footprint standards. So these are still evaluating across all the life cycle stages of a product, but they are focusing in much more detail on carbon alone. So you can see they're going deeper into detail, but narrowing that scope of what metrics they're looking at. And similarly, studies that look exclusively at water, which is critical for areas where water is a scarcity, might want to utilize the water footprint standards instead. So again, the standard is looking at the impacts from a full life cycle perspective, but it's just focused exclusively on water in more detail. So this is another figure I like that lists some of the other ISO standards. And again, these ones are organized largely by those that address organizations and those that address products. What I want to draw your attention to here is the ISO 14040 series that we've just sort of discussed so far that covers the environmental performance of products. But there is also the ISO 14020 series, and these deal with environmental labels and environmental product declarations, or EPDs. And so EPDs are increasingly being used by companies, particularly in construction and materials industries right now, to identify and label the environmental impact of their products. And a lot of people sort of see this as being the environmental equivalent of a nutritional label. What's important to know about the link between these standards is that any EPD process first requires an LCA to be performed first. And then that LCA is then used to help inform the EPD environmental label process. So these, the 14040 and the 14020 are really working hand in hand together. This is an example of an EPD summary sheet. This is just for particle board. And you can see the different life cycle impact categories. They're listed and quantified below. And there are really an increasing number of products that are looking to create these, particularly in the sustainable buildings industry. When you perform an LCA, so I'm just going to get into a little bit of the methods for it. There are 4 stages that an LCA goes through. The first is the goal and scope. Then you have the life cycle inventory, followed by the life cycle impact assessment, and then finally the final interpretation stage, where the practitioner can look back on results and conclusions. One of the things that is really unique and special about this framework, but is not often discussed, is you'll notice there are these bi-directional arrows everywhere in the diagram. And these are what they're doing is they're emphasizing that decisions made in the early stages of an LCA can always be revisited, particularly if the data or the system boundaries that were defined require some adjustments downstream. In my opinion, though, what I think is the most critical step in an LCA is the very first step, so the goal and scope stage. And this is because this is where all the decisions about LCA are made. And these decisions have influence across scope. There are 12 components that should be clearly defined. So things like the system boundaries. So what are the boundaries of the supply chain being considered? What are the assumptions about the data? And one of the things that I was really interested in several years ago when I was completing my PhD was how these 12 components have the potential to affect data or results downstream in those later stages. And what I found is that 7 of these I consider to be especially critical because they are directly linked with the spatial and temporal characteristics of the system boundaries, as well as the parameters that end up being applied to the inventory and impact assessment stages. And so in particular, I really think that focusing on these and defining them really well helps set up the accuracy and precision of the LCA downstream. but often I think are overlooked, particularly in software programs. One of the ways that system boundaries are often discussed is they talk about things like gate-to-gate boundaries or cradle-to-gate boundaries or the whole cradle-to-grave boundaries. All of these terms are really discussing is to what extent an LCA covers all of the life cycle stages. And there might be reasons why a particular study may only want to focus on gate-to-gate boundaries. Maybe they're looking at the efficiencies of a facility. But what I also want to show people is that this framework has a lot of similarities across other impact assessments. So for example, those people who deal with emissions targets might be familiar with things such as scope 1 or scope 2 or scope 3 emissions. But again, what's really being discussed is just simply the different scales at which the life cycle stages are being analyzed. And I think that putting it in this context also helps see how easily LCA can be integrated into other assessment frameworks, particularly when you start to break it down into specific system boundaries. The second stage is what I think most people likely associate with LCA, and this is where you start to build this robust data or data inventory that quantifies all the inputs and all the outputs of each unit process included in the system boundary. Now, one of the challenges when deciding what level of detail to include for each of the unit processes is the difference in scales at which most commercial LCA inventories are compiled when you compare those with what's actually happening on the ground. And this becomes particularly challenging for environmental systems that might change as you move from one location to the next, either due to climate or ecology or other site-specific characteristics. And for example, so this is a figure I made a few years ago when I was doing reviews for bioenergy LCAs as a way to try and illustrate this challenge. So what this drawing or illustration is showing is that most of the LCA databases out there, particularly for commercial software, are using average data. In this particular case, for bioenergy, they're using average land use data from these really large spatial areas, like either national averages or international averages. But these large scale averages might not be able to reflect the small scale changes that are influencing real life. And there are a lot of fugitive emissions associated with environmental systems like agriculture and forestry that can be difficult to measure accurately over large areas, particularly when they vary spatially. Because in reality, land use changes, which people talk about all the time, are really an amalgamation of several different impacts. And they can manifest at a variety of spatial and temporal scales. So in order to understand these emerging issues like land use change and ecosystem values, what is really needed is an understanding of how the responses occurring at these smaller scales are getting away from these large average databases. The third stage of LCA, which is the life cycle impact assessment, this is where you're taking all these inventories that you've compiled and you're translating them into impact categories. And they're usually going to be midpoint or endpoint categories. In most cases, LCAs tend to deal with the midpoint categories, such as climate change or eutrophication or acidification. And there are commercial LCA software packages out there. And what they do is they combine the inventory stage that we just talked about with the impact assessment stage. And they sort of combine them into this single interface system. And these are user-friendly software programs. They make LCA really easy to use. However, the process is really linear and it doesn't capture the constant reevaluation of your goals and scopes assumptions that we talked about or that I talked about in a few slides ago. So for most of these inventories, you don't actually get to see the values of the inventory and you only get to see the results. So it creates a bit of a black box and isn't always the most transparent if you're looking at trying to understand the data. And this is even true for open LCA databases, which you can access for free. The other challenge is that when we're reducing everything to these midpoint endpoint categories, but also using these large average databases, in the software. It means that interpreting what's happening at smaller scales or from how things differ from one location to the next becomes really difficult. So what are some ways that maybe we can avoid these aggregation issues? So one particular approach, and I use this for all of my own LCAs, and I use this for all of my own LCA thinking approaches, is to take a modular system dynamics approach to try and tease out additional detail of unit processes on a case-by-case basis. So rather than relying on these broad databases, I try and separate out each unit process and treat it as its own sort of mini LCA. And that way, by approaching it in a modular way, you can look at different levels of data within the system details and try and approach each unit process optimally. And so for each section or lifecycle stage, there may be all sorts of details that we can tease out and start to model on their own. So this does require details of each process, and it might sound daunting and intensive, but I actually see this as being a really important part of the solution, because you start to see that sustainability inherently needs to engage and enable a whole wide range of experts across a whole range of different fields. So I think that this approach also provides a framework to help link experts from different fields as they come together to try to solve larger problems. What I want to do now is just briefly illustrate how the effects of how LCA results can look at different scales. And I'm going to look at a classic question that people often ask, so what's the better renewable energy option when it comes to carbon and energy balances? Onshore wind and solar PV. So what's pretty consistent across literature is that onshore wind has lower carbon and energy footprints than solar PV. The largest impacts for solar PV is in the production of the modules themselves. And in some cases, more than 80% of the overall life cycle emissions can come from the production, sometimes more than 90%. And there's also advantages from wind when it comes to the end of life stages. So more than 90% of wind turbines can sometimes be recycled. Really, the only challenge right now is in the blades, because they often use resins, and that's a challenge to the recycling part of it. But there are all sorts of different system dynamics that can change those averages when we look at where the data comes from. So for example, there are a number of studies that have highlighted that a large proportion of solar PV modules are manufactured in China, where the electricity used comes from an electricity grid that is 60% coal. So in one study, they found that 45 to 80% of the total impact from that really extensive production process is due to coal electricity. And another really interesting study, or two studies I should say, the solar PV facility in Italy, which had modules from China, produced electricity rate at 88.7 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, whereas a facility in France that uses modules manufactured in Europe had less than half that at 37.5 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. But what is also important to understand as well when you look at the system is that the temporal scales that we look at these impacts from are also important. So for example, a solar panel system that is designed for 30 years will be almost 31% less emissions than those of the 20-year lifespan. So this really is also showcasing the importance of the lifespan of these technologies. From a completely different scale, though, you can answer the question a completely different way. And so similar to what we found out about the beer bottle case study, when it comes to renewable energy, on average, there are no cases where any fossil fuel is going to outperform renewables. So when people get down to splitting hairs about the different impacts of renewable energy and which of them is better, the takeaway should be, literally anything is better than fossil fuels. There might be some that are more optimal than others, depending on where you live. But in most cases, switching to any form of renewable is an improvement, and sort of showcases why we need a robust energy portfolio and not just sort of try and sink our teeth into just one. And so the approach that I take with my company, Greenscale, which largely looks at helping define sustainability solutions, is to use LCA and life cycle thinking so that every project or study we're doing, we're trying to look at it from a range of different scales, because so often, and this is particularly true for communities and organizations and business startups, is we need bottom-up approaches to find solutions. And so it's important that the monitoring systems we have in place assess how well we are doing and are able to put those bottom-up approaches into the context of larger overall results. And this is particularly true for startups where maybe they have a technology or a product that is not well reflected in these databases. And one project that I just recently completed was really interesting. It was a life cycle assessment for Ferris Build Tech. They're a local innovative building company in Kingston, and they make high-performing wall, roof, and floor panels for buildings. And the materials are largely EPS and steel. And I did this in coordination with the Sioux Lookout First Nations Health Authority that services most of the Northern First Nations communities in Ontario. And so they were interested in looking at the life cycle impacts of if they build a community health building using high performance panels versus, say, traditional lumber frame building. And without revealing too much about the overall results, what is interesting is that despite the fact that the high performing walls were made of EPS and steel, and they had nearly twice the embodied carbon of the lumber build, they achieved the same carbon footprint by year 10. And they significantly outperformed the lumber build over a 6-year period on the order of 10 tons of CO2 for one building. And there are two other really interesting aspects about the life cycle changes of these results. We look at them in a bit more detail. So the first is if we were to take that building and place it in a community where the electricity comes from diesel generators as opposed to the Ontario electricity grid, the payback shifts all the way back to year 1. And so sort of going back to the impacts of a dirty electricity grid from the solar modules, the same thing applies here. So after only 1 year, the carbon difference of the Ferris build had already made up that embodied carbon deficit of the lumber build. The second interesting part, and this is related to lifespan, is that the lumber build in these types of environments are very rarely are going to even reach 60 years. They might reach 35 to 40 years. The longevity of the materials in the Ferris wall suggests that they could reach another 40 years and reach 100 years, in which case the overall impacts would be more than less than double the lumber build. And so these are just a number of our clients and organizations we partnered with over the last few years. We've worked with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, which should be releasing a handbook that we helped them write in a few months. We've worked a lot with the City of Kingston on their greenhouse gas inventories and are actively helping them to establish more robust monitoring metrics. We're working on some sustainable forestry management projects. And also in the past year, we've added David Roade as an employee to our projects. And for those of you who don't know David, he was formerly working with the City of Kingston, where he's one of the people that helped the city access funds for the Better Homes Kingston project. So we're really privileged and happy to have David and his expertise on board. And I'm really looking forward to the next few years. I think Greenscale is really positioning itself to be a local leader in sustainability solutions and finding climate change action plans. So I just want to finish with a few takeaways that I hope you get out of today. The first is that LCA is really critical to understanding the true impacts of things. And one of the often overlooked aspects is the actual lifespan of products and systems. And changing lifespans can really have significant impacts in changes, then we can start to avoid things like environmental problem shifting. And one of the classic examples of problem shifting is the large push for CFL light bulbs in the 90s and early 2000s that saw environmental impacts from mercury. The other part that evolves from this thinking is to then use LCA approaches to help inform the public and government and industry about how information derived from LCAs can help support better decision making. I talked a bit about EPDs that are important, but LCA can be used to help support all sorts of different labeling. And because of that, it can also help us make policy and economic decisions that otherwise might find it hard to understand the greenness of things. And one area that is really becoming part of the sustainability lexicon is the concept of circular economies. Well, circular economies are just another way of talking about connecting successive life cycles together. And so similar to facilitating EPDs, LCAs, I think, are needed to help facilitate any attempt at trying to understand circular economies, because you just can't have one without the other. They go hand in hand. And then finally, LCA can help reduce environmental impacts if you can accurately reflect real world dynamics with an LCA approach. And I think here at Greenscale, we have a great business model and techno-environmental approach that I think is able to leverage LCA approaches into enabling these best practice sustainability solutions. So thank you to everyone for joining me today. If you want to get in contact with me, feel free to email me at nathan@greenscale.ca. Feel free to check out our website. We're going to be having some exciting updates the next few weeks on the website. So maybe check that webpage out again in a few weeks before the holidays. Also, feel free to follow myself personally or Greenscale as a company on LinkedIn for periodic updates on what we're doing and interesting research and industry news that we support. And if there are any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them now or in the future. If you've got to go and you want to email me about something, we can talk about a little later. So thank you.
Sorry, having trouble finding my unmute button. Thank you, Nathan. That was awesome. Have some questions that have come in from the chat. If I can find them again. First off, a few people had to run just before the end, and so if you want to provide maybe that last slide, we can, with all your contact details. We will send it out to the membership, and because there was a lot of interest in follow-up. One question that came in was, why are we seeing the switch from glass to cans for beer bottles?
I think largely because of upfront cost. So the cost to the brewer themselves is a lot less on a per unit basis. And for a lot of craft breweries, they're just not part of the beer bottle collective. They're not part of the groups that are that have those beer bottles. So it's sort of an access to that that beer bottle system is why we see a lot of these craft beers shifting towards those cans.
So nothing that couldn't be changed, but it's a barrier to entry to use glass.
Yeah.
Okay. Just looking through the okay, Joan asked, how about a local Kingston residential demo home, low life carbon embedded or otherwise? Have you done any LCAs on standard builds in Kingston versus a low carbon build?
Not in Kingston. I'd love to. I was working with the Queen's engineering students. They were working on a small house design last year. And I was going to help them with their LCA for their small home. Right as we were talking, the students who were mostly in fourth year had moved on. So I'm hoping to pick that conversation up local to try and help support local builds and understanding labeling local LCA for buildings.
Perfect. Well, thank you for that. And as I said, there's an awful lot of people that want to talk to you. So this is hopefully good for business, which is part of the switch mandate. So this is great. I see Maria Skordaki has her hand up. If she wants to unmute, we can start doing some live ones.
Yes, thank you, David, and thank you, Nathan. This is a very, very interesting presentation. A lot of food for thought. Among the, a few other questions. I have one that I'd like to discuss with you. Perhaps the others who might be offline or via email. In one of your slides, I think the later ones, you had a statement: anything other than fossil fuels is better. And I agree with you. However, there is some case studies that I'm working on, and this is mostly on military infrastructure, that we see that there's the math there, and the qualitative data sometimes don't exactly align with this, although we want to see that way. For example, I'll just give you some context here. We're looking into sustainable aviation fuels for Royal Canadian Air Force, and basically trying to reduce, or at least inform them about their carbon footprint. Now, all of our stuff is produced outside of Canada, so we're importing. That means that the carbon footprint there should also be calculated or taken into consideration. Therefore, the question is, then why bother? If you're going to, if you have like oil in Alberta, for example, then you're bringing something from Europe or US, maybe at this point, this, anything other than fossil fuel doesn't work. Like the math doesn't really align, but we're trying to go green. So do you have any feedback on this one? That would be very, very useful. Thank you so much.
Or at least I had problems getting connected for most of it, so I only got part of it.
So I think what's interesting, and I left the bit out just for time. But
could we have everybody else mute, please?
So I was like right at the intersection of John Counter and then I got
hello. We get everybody to mute.
It wasn't.
Right.
Oh, it hasn't opened yet.
It hasn't
Oh,
opened.
okay.
So 13th is the opening day or whatever.
Oh, okay.
So I think it has a lot to do with
I never thought about that.
Yeah.
Just a sec. Rick?
People just gonna be sitting there waiting, and I was like,
Rick?
Yeah. Ouch.
That's gonna be not great.
Okay.
The host should have the ability to mute him.
Could everybody mute? Could everybody mute, please? We're getting a lot of back chatter.
Okay.
Thank you.
So one point I didn't put up, and it had to do with the distance for that recycling materials travel for wind turbines and solar PV, and just reducing the distance to 100 or 200 kilometers that they had to travel was enough to change the whole life cycle impact by, say, 10%. And that's just the recycling part of it. And the recycling part in of itself is only maybe 15%. So I think that, I think you're absolutely right. And that we have to really start to include more of these transportation pathways, not just see what the overall impact is, but because you can start to see, well, where's the best solution moving forward?
Perfect.
Thank you very much, Nathan. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, a question from the chat. Are businesses reaching out because of the new recycling rules?
Not yet. I haven't heard anything about that. I think this is certainly something that would help the businesses make better decisions, though. I think that understanding the full life cycle, because this is one particular example of how we can really dangerously get into some environmental problem shifting if we start to just wipe away single-use plastics and not look at where the overall life cycle impacts are coming from. Yeah, and I think there's a lot, from what I hear, there's a lot of political infighting right now as the new system gets up and running. So they've got maybe bigger fish to fry right now. Yeah. Another question from Harriet. Based picture, i.e. land development. So yeah. So actually, one of the groups that I'm directly involved with, I sat on the board for the Ontario Woodlot Association for a couple of years. For those of you who don't know, the Ontario Woodlot Association is a grassroots organization across Ontario that helps support sustainable forest management for those who have private forests. They have a great Facebook page. They run all sorts of community events, and they're doing a lot of great work right now. Just received a huge grant in coordination with CRIBE. So over the next few years, they're going to be working with CRIBE and using LiDAR to try and develop a private forest inventory, which I think will be really critical for helping to understand the carbon sequestration of these private forests and these private lands, because it's these lands that are sort of being grabbed up and used for land development. One of the other thing I think to look at is there's a couple groups out there, and I've been a part of this, where they're looking at ecosystem services, and I forget the particular reference off the top of my head, but there was a study done maybe 10 years ago on the ecosystem values of the Green Belt. And I think that for Southern Ontario, the Green Belt was something like, just under $400 million annually that it provided for costs such as flood relief and things like that. So I think that, particularly in today's political age and talking about green belts and land and carbons and things like that, some people are sometimes hesitant to try and put a value on ecosystem services. I see it as being a really important tool to try and showcase the true value of ecosystems and the true value of land and carbon. So, yeah.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. There's a really long comment / question from Peter. If Peter wants to unmute, maybe we should just talk that one through.
Yeah, just a quick comment, Nathan. In the industry I worked in, retired from for 40 some years, there's a real issue in that the standards for approval were rewritten 40 years ago and we're still working with the same base of standards, and they've eliminated all the longevity requirements and components from the standards. So as one of the research director of a major firm told me back then, I hate these new standards. If I could produce a product out of chicken feathers and get it to last long enough to get through the lab next week, I could get approved. And we are still seeing that. I and a lot of people with knowledge of our industry refuse to pay any attention to Energy Star for Windows. That's the industry. Because we know that those things that improve the energy performance generally decrease the longevity. How do you do a life cycle analysis when there's no objective underlying data? There's people to tell you what the lifespan is. There's people like me in the industry who know, but we can only give you anecdotal stuff. I pay $850 a year to heat my house with electric resistance. I have windows in my house that are no longer approved by the building code, but I am not replacing them. They're 30 years old and I haven't touched them, and they will outlast me.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there's two parts of it. The first part is that data acquisition is always a challenge. And this is where I think I put the slide up about enabling and engaging with the experts. For a lot of the work that I've done, I'll start off with looking at those databases, but it's really about going and talking to individuals like yourself and getting more of that anecdotal data and information. What I do from there is, this is, really the best thing you can do is you come up with an estimate. And then after that is you perform a sensitivity analysis. So you say, okay, well, if my estimate is this much off, either by 30% in this direction or 30% in this direction, how does that affect the overall results? And that leads in the sort of second part of the question, which is, so for example, in the case of the LCA that I did for the Ferris building up north, is that what I do is I plug it into a model. And so I change the different values for each section. So I say, okay, if the window lasts this long, but it's this poor performing, what does it look like? Or if the window is really well performing, here's the lifespan. And then what you can do is then you start to look at, okay, well, if it only lasts this long, what are the impacts from its landfill or its recycling or its reuse? And so this is where using that sort of modular approach to LCA, total, it still allows you to see where in that life cycle stage or how much of the overall life cycle that particular impact can change. So I see modeling as a way to sort of explore things a bit more accurately. It's not going to be perfect, but nothing is when it comes to data.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in on a personal example. I work for Fire Rain. We engaged Nathan. We haven't completed the project, but we've engaged Nathan regarding our fire suppression product, which is all bio-based. It's all food grade materials that you've probably eaten. And the question was, what is the sort of total life of our product versus ones that are made from synthetic surfactants, the foams that we compete against? Because, two of our products come from offshore, one from China, one from the Middle East, the rest are grown in Ontario. So how does that impact, our total LCA when you're taking into account all these shipping costs? So it's a very interesting problem. I mean, obviously we hope our impact is lower, but we won't know until we do the analysis. And it's very, very telling, and it makes you really think about supply chain and all of that. I don't know, Nathan, if you got any comments on that, but it just as a practical example of how our industry is looking to use this type of information or this type of analysis.
Yeah, I think that's one of the key areas, particularly in that field, any type of manufacturing. I see Jim has some questions here.
Yep.
I haven't spoke at Chambers of Commerce before. I have done lots of other speaking events, so I'd certainly be happy to talk about that. The question here, does LiDAR capture wetlands real values? LiDAR, for the most part, is showcasing you what's there and what type of land cover is there, and maybe to some extent the different layers, depending on what type of frequency you're using. From there is where you could then start to tease out what the ecosystem values are, but it requires a bit of an additional analysis beyond just the LiDAR. So the LiDAR is a really great first step to sort of create a vegetation or ecology inventory, but then from there it's about establishing more better estimates of what those values are. There's a report that I co-authored several years ago for the United States Agency for International Development. It's a really good report that speaks to different ways that you can evaluate ecosystem values and ecosystems. And there's a lot of good case studies there. Another question here about Energy Star. Any thoughts on their products? So for Energy Star products and things that have those types of labels are what I would classify as something that is showcasing the performance of that product for a particular life cycle stage. So, Energy Star appliances and things like that, what they're showing you is this is certified to operate and use less energy in this particular phase of the life cycle stage. So it's really important for understanding and reducing your footprint in a particular area. It doesn't necessarily address the impacts of the whole life cycle stage. So I think Energy Star and those types of labels were really good first steps, but I don't think that they aren't the best way forward. I think that taking a much more comprehensive LCA approach and creating a much more comprehensive full life cycle stage label is the better way to help consumers make the most informed choices. But also for policymakers, if you're going to be footing the bill and adding millions of dollars to offset buying a product, so you want to make sure it's the greenest one you can do. Comments. Last one here, comments on spray foam applications. This is actually a really interesting one because it sort of gets into, this is where it gets into looking at different environmental impacts. So I talked a bit about, there's carbon, you can assess the environmental impacts of carbon and water, eutrophication, acidification. Human health and human health toxicity can also take into consideration impacts from, say, air quality. So one of the areas that's starting to expand, so when you look at LCAs, most of them are going to sort of either look at carbon, energy, acidification, eutrophication. Those are the big ones. It's really important for a lot of these emerging products that we start to look at some of the other environmental impacts, such as release of dioxins from plastics and things like that. So that's really important as well. So I think that, not just having carbon out there, again, this is another example of problem shifting. You might have a product that has zero carbon, but if it's releasing a whole bunch of CFCs, or if it's, degrading the environment in other ways, or releasing metals, we don't want to be shifting those things elsewhere.
Hugh McLaren, he's got his hand up. Thanks.
Oh, I was just about to put it down because your last comment addressed my question about the life cycle cost impact and the acidification and the chlorofluorocarbons and that. But I guess I would ask, this can get pretty complicated, and I assume pretty costly. Where do you draw the line as a company to really focus your efforts on? Is carbon seems to be the big one right now, but obviously we are aware of our impacts from global warming to ozone depletion, acidification, and the word I can't pronounce but has to do with the water.
Yeah, that's a good question. Complicated. The LCA to make this LCA more specific, but it's, what you do is you say, look, this is the best that we can do. If we're going to tease it out, we're going to do it on the next LCA. So this is the other part of LCA is very, I think, iterative. We don't want to use LCA necessarily as a report card. I think of it it's more like an elementary school report card where it should have, some details about how you can improve for the next time. So, I see the LCA as being like, you don't have to do it perfect the first time, get it to where you're comfortable. And then from there, then let's tease out the next level of details. And that's actually also in the method itself. If you can't necessarily disaggregate or aggregate your data appropriately, you're supposed to go through, finish what you do know, and then work on trying to make those the details a lot more in that particular stage.
So
thanks.
I'm conscious of time here, and Darko has to be somewhere else by 9:30, and he's the host today. There are a few questions that we didn't get to, but as I said, we will get Nathan's contact details to everybody that is on our distribution list, and we'll make sure that we've got it that way. One thing I did forget to do at the beginning, which I really want to, is recognize our ongoing support from our members. We had Spark Center, Just Renew, and individual members of Mark Sibley, Brent Pepley, and Peter Walker. Thank you, Peter, you're on the call. And I know Nathan's is in the mail. So So I'm going to sort of call it now. Thank you, Nathan. This was absolutely mind-bogglingly interesting. I really enjoyed it, and it gave me some good context for when we start up discussions again about what we're going to do from my company standpoint. And Darko, you're heading out.
So as my parting gift to show you my class, please. They're assembling right now.
Alrighty. Anyway,
And I'm stopping the recording now, and then
Right.
thanks to everybody. And
all right. So
again, apologies for glitches at the start.
yeah, but we made it work. Next, our next open meeting is January 6th. Following in February, we're going to be doing our annual general meeting, and we hope we have as good a turnout as we had today for the AGM. So anyway, Nathan, thank you again.
Thank you.
Stellar talk, and have a good morning, everybody.
Bye,
Thank you.
everybody.
Bye for now.
Thank you, everyone.